In the summer of 1985, a KGB officer stood outside a Moscow bakery holding a Safeway shopping bag, waiting for a signal that might never come. If it did, he would attempt the most dangerous escape in Cold War history. If it didn't, he would almost certainly be executed. 2 years earlier, this same man had single-handedly prevented a nuclear war, passing intelligence so critical it changed the mind of a president and pulled the world back from the brink. His name was Oleg Gordievsky. And this is how a loyal KGB officer's son became the most important spy of the 20th century. Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky was born on October 10, 1938, in Moscow, into a family where loyalty to the Soviet state wasn't just expected, it was inherited. His father, Anton Gordievsky, was an officer of the NKVD, the feared precursor to the KGB, and wore his allegiance to the security apparatus like a second skin. His elder brother Vasily would follow the same path, joining the KGB's Illegals Directorate, the shadowy division responsible for planning deep-cover agents in foreign countries under false identities. Young Oleg was, by all appearances, a model product of this system. Brilliant, disciplined, fluent in languages, he studied at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, the elite academy that served as a finishing school for Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers alike. He joined the KGB in the early 1960s and was posted abroad, exactly as the state intended. There was no reason to doubt him. No reason at all. But the cracks in his faith had already begun to form. In 1961, Gordievsky witnessed the construction of the Berlin Wall, not as a fortification against Western aggression, as Soviet propaganda claimed, but as a cage, a barrier built to imprison an entire population. The sight of families torn apart, of soldiers with rifles preventing their own citizens from fleeing, left a mark on him that never faded. He began quietly to question the system he served. His first posting to Copenhagen in the mid-1960s deepened the fracture. Denmark was everything the Soviet Union was not: prosperous, open, free. He walked through streets where people spoke their minds without fear, where bookshops carried literature that would have landed a Soviet citizen in the Gulag. The contrast was devastating. As he later told author Ben McIntyre, he blossomed as a human being, while looking back at the Soviet Union as a vast, sterile concentration camp. Then came the event that shattered his loyalty entirely. In August 1968, 2,000 Soviet tanks rolled across the border into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, the brief, hopeful experiment in democratic reform led by Alexander Dubček. Gordievsky watched in horror as Moscow crushed the aspirations of an entire nation simply for daring to imagine a freer life. He described the invasion as an act of brutality against innocent people that ignited in him a burning, passionate hatred for the communist system. By the time the KGB recalled him to Moscow in 1970, suspecting that Danish intelligence had identified him, Gordievsky was a man at war with himself. He despised the gray, suffocating capital, a city that, as McIntyre would later write, stank of boiled cabbage and blocked drains. For 2 years he endured dreary bureaucratic work, waiting for another chance. And in 1972, that chance came. Denmark had expelled several Soviet intelligence officers, and the KGB needed someone fluent in Danish. They sent Gordievsky back to Copenhagen. This time, British intelligence was ready. Danish security services had flagged his return and alerted MI6, who suspected this particular KGB officer might be ripe for recruitment. They moved with exquisite care. First, they sent a mutual acquaintance, an old university friend who had defected to the West, to make contact, to gauge Gordievsky's state of mind. The two met for lunch and reminisced, but beneath the pleasantries, both men understood the unspoken question hanging in the air. Sensing an opening, MI6's Copenhagen station chief, Richard Bromhead, engineered a seemingly chance encounter at Gordievsky's badminton club. They had lunch together, polite, careful, non-committal. Months later, they met again. And this time, Gordievsky removed all ambiguity. He looked at Bromhead and said simply, "No one is aware that I am meeting you." With those words, one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the Cold War was born. In 1974, Oleg Gordievsky formally became an agent of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service. What made Gordievsky extraordinary was not just his access, but his motivation. Unlike most defectors, he refused payment. He wasn't driven by greed or grievance or ego. As Baroness Margaret Ramsay, a former MI6 case officer, would later explain, he simply saw that the Soviet system was a lie. Over the following years, he exposed Soviet agents embedded across Scandinavia, including Gunvor Havik, a Norwegian foreign ministry official who had been spying for Moscow for nearly 3 decades, and Arne Treholt, a high-ranking Norwegian diplomat whose betrayal stunned the Western intelligence community. After a period back in Moscow, during which MI6 deliberately severed all contact to protect him, Gordievsky was posted to London in 1982. It was the prize both he and MI6 had been hoping for. He had risen through the ranks to become deputy head of the KGB's London station, operating under diplomatic cover with access to the innermost workings of Soviet intelligence strategy. MI6 even arranged for his direct superior, Igor Titov, to be expelled from Britain so that Gordievsky could be promoted further. He became head of political intelligence and eventually the resident designate, the senior KGB officer in one of Moscow's most important foreign stations. And it was from this extraordinary vantage point that Gordievsky witnessed something that chilled him to the bone. In 1981, KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, who would become Soviet General Secretary the following year, had launched Operation Ryan. The acronym stood for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, nuclear missile attack. It was the largest peacetime intelligence gathering operation in Soviet history, and its purpose was singular and terrifying: to detect signs that NATO was preparing a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. The instructions that flowed out from Moscow Center read like the anxious fantasies of men who had stopped sleeping. KGB and GRU stations across the globe were ordered to monitor an almost absurd catalog of indicators. Were blood banks in Western capitals increasing their reserves, perhaps stockpiling for wartime casualties? Were lights burning late in government buildings, evidence of around-the-clock war planning? Were there unusual numbers of cars in Pentagon parking lots, suggesting high-level crisis meetings? Officers were expected to report on all of it, filing regular dispatches whether they had evidence or not. What made Operation Ryan so dangerous was that it was not theater. The men who ordered it, Andropov, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, the aging generals of the Politburo, genuinely believed that America and its allies might launch a preemptive nuclear attack at any moment. And the system they had built ensured that their fear would be reflected back to them. Field officers, pressured to find evidence of Western aggression, found it or invented it. The echo chamber tightened with every dispatch. The paranoia was not entirely irrational. President Ronald Reagan had adopted the most confrontational anti-Soviet rhetoric in a generation, calling the USSR an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. The United States was deploying Pershing II missiles to Western Europe, weapons capable of reaching Moscow in under 10 minutes, barely enough time for Soviet leaders to reach their bunkers, let alone make rational decisions. Ustinov and the aging, ailing Andropov fed each other's worst fears in a spiral of mutual suspicion that no one around them dared interrupt. Then, on September 1st, 1983, a Soviet interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people on board, including a sitting United States congressman. The international outcry was volcanic. Relations between Washington and Moscow plummeted to their lowest point in decades. Both sides were now viewing each other through a lens of pure hostility, and the margin for miscalculation had narrowed to almost nothing. It was into this volatile atmosphere, with Operation Ryan still pulsing through every Soviet intelligence station and the wreckage of a passenger jet still scattered across the Sea of Japan, that NATO launched Able Archer 83 on November 2, 1983. It was an annual command post exercise simulating the alliance's response to a nuclear conflict. But this iteration was different, unprecedentedly realistic. It featured participation by heads of government, new communication protocols never before used, and a practice escalation through every stage of conflict, from conventional warfare to chemical weapons to the ultimate threshold, a coordinated nuclear release. To NATO planners, it was an exercise. To Moscow, it looked like the real thing. Gordievsky reported to MI6 that something extraordinary was happening inside Soviet intelligence. In Moscow's gray-walled KGB center on Dzerzhinsky Square, cipher clerks fed priority messages into encryption machines and dispatched flash telegrams, the highest priority communications in the Soviet system, to residencies around the world. The telegrams warned that Able Archer might be cover for an actual NATO first strike. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on heightened alert. Bomber crews sat in cockpits on snow-dusted runways, gloved hands on throttles, waiting for the order. Strategic missile units in their underground silos entered advanced readiness. The Kremlin leadership, under the paranoid and physically deteriorating Andropov, surrounded by hardliners like Ustinov, genuinely believed that nuclear war might be hours away. This was the intelligence that changed the world. Gordievsky's reports made unmistakably clear that this was not strategic posturing by Moscow, not a negotiating tactic, not political theater. The Soviet leadership was authentically, viscerally afraid. They believed they were about to die, and they were preparing to strike first rather than be annihilated. The difference between a bluff and genuine fear is the difference between a diplomatic crisis and the end of civilization. Gordievsky told MI6 which one it was. MI6 passed his intelligence to the Joint Intelligence Committee, which briefed Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher grasped the implications immediately. She understood that Gordievsky was offering something unprecedented, a window directly into the Kremlin's mind at the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. She ensured the warning was transmitted to President Reagan through multiple channels, including Britain's ambassador to Washington, Sir Oliver Wright, and directly through the CIA. Reagan was profoundly shaken. He had never imagined that his rhetoric and NATO's military posture could have been interpreted as preparations for a genuine first strike. In his personal diary, he wrote with something approaching disbelief, "Do the Soviets really believe that? I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about." The realization landed hard, that the Soviet leaders whom he had cast as calculating aggressors were in fact frightened men preparing for what they believed was their own destruction. It was a turning point not just in policy, but in Reagan's understanding of his adversary. The president began a deliberate, sustained pivot. The bellicose language softened. The rhetoric of confrontation gave way to calls for dialogue. Reagan's famous Ivan and Anya speech in January 1984, in which he imagined ordinary Soviet and American couples meeting and discovering their shared humanity, would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Behind the scenes, Washington opened new channels of communication with Moscow, designed specifically to prevent the kind of catastrophic misunderstanding that Able Archer had nearly triggered. This shift in posture survived Andropov's death and the brief tenure of Konstantin Chernenko, ultimately bearing fruit when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. The groundwork Gordievsky's intelligence had laid, the understanding that Moscow needed reassurance, not threats, helped make possible the dialogue that led to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first agreement in history to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. The world stepped back from the precipice, and Oleg Gordievsky had been the one to sound the alarm. But the cost of his courage was staggering. In the spring of 1985, CIA officer Aldrich Ames, one of only a handful of Americans who knew Gordievsky's identity, sold that secret to the KGB for money. Gordievsky was suddenly recalled to Moscow, drugged with a truth serum called SP-117, and interrogated for 5 brutal hours. He never confessed. He clung to one thought, borrowed from the playbook of the infamous double agent Kim Philby: deny, deny, deny. Lacking a confession or irrefutable proof, the KGB released him, but placed him under constant surveillance, bugging his apartment, following his every movement. Gordievsky knew the net was closing. On a Tuesday evening in the summer of 1985, he activated a prearranged escape signal, showing up outside a Moscow bakery carrying a Safeway shopping bag. He stood on the designated spot and waited, his pulse hammering, watching the crowd for a familiar face. Then, an MI6 officer, Arthur G., walked past eating a Mars bar and carrying a green Harrods bag. The message was received. Operation Pimlico was go. What followed was a journey of terrifying uncertainty. Gordievsky boarded an overnight train, then a bus, traveling north through the Russian countryside toward the Finnish border. He disembarked at a remote stop and plunged into the forest, hiding in mosquito-infested undergrowth, waiting for the extraction team that might never come. Hours passed. Every sound, a snapping branch, a distant engine, could have been the KGB closing in. Then, precisely on schedule, MI6 officers Roy and Caroline Ascot, along with Arthur and Rachel G., pulled up on a forest road near the border. They had 80 seconds. Gordievsky emerged from the trees, and they bundled him into the trunk of a diplomatic car. At the Soviet-Finnish border, with sniffer dogs circling and guards checking vehicles, Caroline Ascot changed her baby's diaper directly over the trunk where Gordievsky lay motionless. She dropped the soiled nappy beside a German shepherd, straining at its leash. The dog slunk away, offended. The guards, grimacing, waved them through. The operation had been personally authorized by Margaret Thatcher, who insisted that Britain must honor its promises to its agent. At 3:15 p.m. Finnish time, Oleg Gordievsky crossed to freedom. The team had given themselves only a 20% chance of success. The world's most valuable spy had been smuggled out of the Soviet Union in a car boot, past checkpoints and sniffer dogs and KGB surveillance, and lived to tell the story. He left behind his wife Layla and their 2 young daughters, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. 2 years later, a letter from Layla was smuggled out by a Finnish truck driver. "Why didn't you tell me?" she wrote. "How could you abandon me?" It would take 6 years and the personal intervention of both Thatcher and Reagan before his family was allowed to leave the Soviet Union. By then, the marriage could not survive what had come between them. The Soviet Union sentenced Gordievsky to death in absentia. Russia never rescinded that sentence and never stopped regarding him as a traitor. He lived out his remaining decades somewhere in England under an assumed name, always looking over his shoulder. On March 4th, 2025, Oleg Gordievsky died at the age of 86, a man who had risked everything, sacrificed his family, and lived in permanent exile. All because he saw through the lie of the system he was born into and understood that silence in the face of potential annihilation was not an option. The world he helped save will likely never fully know what it owes him.